My name is Janet. I am 49 years old. The federal prosecutor sitting across from my kitchen table said the confession letter matched my original report so closely that his team had spent 3 days ruling out the possibility that someone had given the suspect access to my findings before he wrote it. He said this calmly. The way people state facts that are about to permanently rearrange everything inside a room. My ex-husband was sitting to my left. He had been sitting there for 11 minutes. In those 11 minutes, Philip had not looked at me once. After the prosecutor finished that sentence, Philip did not look away from my face for the rest of the meeting. I had kept the original report in a manila folder inside a gray plastic bin in my storage unit for 8 years. I had not opened the folder in 4 of those years, but I always knew exactly where it was. This is not a story about being right. Anyone can be right. Being right costs nothing, unless someone else needs you to be wrong. This is a story about what you do with the copy you kept when everyone around you decided the original did not exist. This is a story about a woman who filed an arson report on a Tuesday, watched it get overturned by Friday, put a copy in a gray plastic bin, and waited. And about what the waiting cost. And about what it finally returned. I became a fire investigator in the fall of 2001, which is a year most people remember for one very specific reason and then forget, was also filled with 1,000 ordinary things that kept happening anyway. I was 26 years old. I had spent the previous 3 years working as a structural firefighter out of a station in the northern part of Charlotte, which is a city that does not get the storms it should and gets the humidity it absolutely does not deserve. I was the kind of firefighter who annoyed her supervisors by asking too many follow-up questions after every scene. Why did the flame pattern run toward the staircase instead of away from it? Why was the accelerant smell strongest at the threshold rather than near the point of origin? Why did the south window fail before the east wall when the east wall had the older framing? My captain at the time, a man named Roderick, who had been doing the job for 30 years and had the forearms of someone who has carried things his whole life, told me once that I either needed to become an investigator or learn to stop asking questions that made everyone uncomfortable during the debrief. I took it as a compliment. He may not have meant it as one. The investigator certification took 2 years, combined with fieldwork and a documentation requirement of 60 verified scene examinations. I kept a separate notebook for those 60 examinations. The notebook is on the shelf in my office right now, beside the gray plastic bin. I am that kind of person, the kind who keeps things, the kind who annotates in margins, the kind who drives her daughter slightly crazy by maintaining the car maintenance log in the glove compartment and updating it every single time without exception, including the time the oil change took 3 minutes because the mechanic was fast and I was the only customer and it felt almost too small to record. I recorded it. By 2005, I had been assigned to a dedicated arson investigation unit within the fire department and had worked 41 confirmed arson cases in 4 years. 41 cases where someone had decided that burning something down was a faster or more profitable option than whatever the alternative was. Some of those cases were business owners who had run out of road. Some were domestic situations where the property itself had become the argument. Some were juveniles who were testing something they did not fully understand and were lucky that what they tested did not kill anyone. And some were what you might call professionals, people who had a specific outcome in mind, who had studied the mechanics of fire, who had made deliberate choices about accelerant selection and ignition timing and scene staging. Those were the cases that required everything I had. Those were the cases I was built for. My back started giving me trouble in 2015. The injury came from a floor collapse during a commercial fire in a building that should have been evacuated but was not evacuated completely, which is a distinction that matters and that I thought about for a long time afterward. I had gone to the second floor to verify that an office space was clear. The subfloor gave way without warning. I fell 12 feet. I landed badly. I did not lose consciousness. I remember the exact sound the floor made in the half second before it went, and I remember thinking very clearly that this was going to cost me something significant. It cost me 2 surgeries. It cost me 11 months of restricted duty. It cost me a specific kind of pain that lives in the lower left side of my spine and reactivates every time the barometric pressure drops ahead of a storm front moving in from the west. I can read the weather better than most meteorologists by simply paying attention to the quality of that ache. When people notice the slight change in how I walk on cold or rainy days and ask about it, I say it is nothing. I have said it enough times that I almost believe it. Almost. Philip thought I was being stoic when I downplayed the injury. He said that regularly, in the tone that sounds like a compliment but arrives as a complaint. You do not have to be stoic, Janet. You could actually tell me when something hurts. I would think, I am telling you. I am telling you by still going. I am telling you by scheduling the appointments and doing the physical therapy exercises in the hallway at 5:30 in the morning so the noise does not wake Sophie. He wanted words. He wanted the specific articulation of pain in a format that would allow him to respond to it. I did not have those words. I had the actions, which he mostly chose not to read. We had been married for 14 years when the arson case happened. We had Sophie, who was 6 at the time and had already developed her father's particular gift for being disappointed in someone in a way that looks almost identical to concern. We had a house in a neighborhood that flooded slightly every spring and had a back fence that perpetually needed replacing. We had Saturday morning pancakes and a dog named Mural, which I had named after a case I worked early in my career involving a church fire and a quantity of paint solvent that the facilities manager had stored improperly behind the choir room. Philip had always hated that name for a dog. I had always found his discomfort with it faintly funny. Those are the kinds of small, irreconcilable differences that seem like nothing when a marriage is working and seem like everything when it is not. The fire at the Kellner Street warehouse happened on a Wednesday morning in March of 2016. I got the call at 6:14 in the morning and I was on scene by 7. It was the kind of March morning that Charlotte does occasionally, cold enough that your breath shows, but not cold enough to justify a heavy coat, and the steam coming off the debris field mixed with the morning air in a way that made everything look softer than it was. The building was a commercial warehouse on the eastern side of the city, approximately 15,000 square feet, built in the 1980s. It had been owned for the previous 18 months by a man named Marcus Keene, who was 44 years old and who had been carrying a commercial insurance policy on the structure with a replacement value of $1.2 million. Those are facts I learned later in the course of the investigation. What I knew at 7 in the morning, standing in the steam and the cold with the fire still smoldering in the eastern corner and my notebook already open, was that the burn pattern on the south wall of the structure was wrong. Fire burns in patterns that follow physics. It moves upward and outward from its point of origin. It travels along fuel paths determined by the combustible materials present in the space, following the paths of least resistance in the same way water follows a slope. When you stand in a fire scene after the fact and look carefully at what the fire left behind, you can read backward through those patterns the way a geologist reads the exposed layers of a hillside. You can identify the origin point with precision if you know what you are looking at. You can identify the presence of accelerants by the depth and shape of the char. By the way, an accelerated burn creates a specific type of irregular floor staining that differs from the staining created by furniture or stored materials burning on their own timelines. You can identify the sequence in which materials burned by examining how each layer interacts with the layer beneath it. This is not mystical. It is physics. It is chemistry. It is geometry. The south wall told me 3 things that morning. It told me there had been a secondary ignition point approximately 6 meters from the primary ignition point, which is unusual in accidental fires because accidental fires do not generally have secondary ignition points unless there is a clear structural reason for a second origin. It told me that the burn pattern on the floor between those 2 points showed the kind of irregular saturation staining that a poured accelerant creates when it has been applied in a line and allowed to absorb into the concrete before ignition. Concrete does not absorb accelerant the way wood does, but in sufficient quantity, applied slowly, a petroleum-based product will leave a signature in the char that is distinct from what you see when a spilled material burns on the surface. And it told me that the 2 large doors on the south side of the structure, which the building records indicated should have been padlocked from the outside, had both been unlocked before the fire began. I took 14 photographs of that south wall before I moved to the central section of the building. I took 7 photographs of the floor near the loading dock on the east side, where the char depth was inconsistent in a way that matched poured accelerant distribution rather than the burn pattern of stored materials. I photographed both door locks from 3 angles each. I documented the absence of any visible forced entry on the exterior, and I noted the condition of a ventilation panel near the roofline on the north side of the structure that had been opened from the interior, which is not something a building owner typically does before walking away from a vacant warehouse in the middle of the night. I collected samples from 4 locations on the south wall floor and submitted them for laboratory accelerant analysis. I documented everything in real time with field notes that I then expanded into formal documentation the same evening. The laboratory returned the analysis 3 days later with a result consistent with a petroleum-based product. That result was not among the materials the building was registered to store. I wrote the formal report over the following 3 days. I used the language the report format required, and I was precise with it. I identified both origin points and described their relationship to each other. I described the floor pattern anomalies in the language of the National Fire Protection Association Guide, citing the specific chapters relevant to accelerant distribution patterns. I cited the door conditions and the ventilation panel. I noted the absence of forced entry. I included all 14 south wall photographs and the 7 loading dock photographs. I attached the laboratory report in full. I described my professional determination. This fire was intentionally set. I submitted the report on a Tuesday morning. By Friday afternoon, Captain Darrell Owens had it overturned. He called me into his office on that Friday and he closed the door, which is a thing he did not always do and which I registered immediately. He sat behind his desk with the report in front of him and he told me the determination was inconclusive. He said I was reading too much into the burn pattern. He said the laboratory results were not definitive enough to support an arson determination on their own. He said the unlocked doors could represent a prior oversight by the building owner and could not be treated as evidence of intent. He said the ventilation panel was a common building defect in structures of that era and that type of construction. And then he said, and I remember this sentence with a clarity that suggests my brain has filed it in the permanent category rather than the working memory category, that I had a tendency to find what I was already looking for. I said, the pattern is too consistent to be undetermined. He said, it is your interpretation of the pattern that is consistent, not the pattern itself. I said, what is your interpretation of the floor staining between the 2 origin points? He said, Janet, he said it the way people use a name as a period at the end of a sentence they do not intend to continue. He said he had been doing this for 30 years. I said, I know. He said the decision had been made. I said, by whom? He looked at me for a moment that had a specific quality I have thought about many times since. Not hostile, not apologetic. The quality of someone who has already made a calculation and is finished making it. He said, by the department. He said I should close out the file and move forward to the next case on the assignment list. I left his office. I walked down the hallway to the records room. I went to the copy machine outside the records room door, and I made 1 complete copy of the report. All text pages, all 14 south wall photographs, all 7 loading dock photographs, the laboratory analysis, and my field notes. I put the copy in a manila folder. I labeled the folder with the case number and the date. I put the folder in my bag and I carried it out to my truck at the end of the shift. I want to be precise about my state of mind when I did that. I was not planning a legal strategy. I was not thinking about a future prosecution or a future vindication or anything that could be described as a long game. I kept the copy because something inside me, a signal I have learned over the years to treat as serious even when I cannot fully articulate its source, said, do not let this be the only copy that exists in a place where someone else controls access. That signal has an excellent track record. I did not need to understand it fully to act on it. Philip was in the kitchen when I got home that evening. Sophie was already asleep. He was making tea, which is a thing he did when he could not settle. And the kitchen had the specific atmosphere of a person who has been sitting with something and is waiting to not be alone with it anymore. I told him what had happened. I told him the department had overturned the finding and that I was certain the finding was correct and that I had kept a copy. He said, okay. I said, it matters. He said, I believe you. He said it quickly, and I think he believed he meant it when he said it. But there was already something in his voice that was not quite fully there. In the weeks that followed, I did not speak about the report often. I went back to my current case assignments. I had 3 concurrent cases requiring active work, and I gave them what they needed. But Philip began to notice when I was reviewing fire investigation materials at my desk that were not connected to any current case. He noticed once and said, "Are you still thinking about that warehouse?" I said some. He said, "The case is closed." I said, "I know." He said, "Is this going to be a thing with you?" I said I did not know what he meant. He said, "Janet, you know what I mean." I did know what he meant. He meant that I had a history of carrying things past the point where carrying them was useful, and that this history was wearing on him. He was not entirely wrong about the history. I had kept the maintenance logs for a car I sold in 2012. I had kept my field notes from a case that was resolved through a separate legal proceeding 3 years after I worked the scene, just in case the resolution was ever challenged. Philip experienced my habit of retention as a symptom of something he could not name precisely, so he named it imprecisely as obsession. He used that word occasionally in arguments, not cruelly, just with the accuracy of someone who has located the exact word that will create the most precise wound. I knew he did not mean it as cruelty. I also knew that it was not nothing. The marriage did not end that year. It ended 18 months later, for a collection of reasons that were all connected and none of which were entirely separable. The report was in that collection. The back injury was in that collection, specifically the way the injury had made me less physically present in the evenings, because I was spending the early evenings 3 times a week at a physical therapist 30 minutes away and arriving home at 7:30 tired and quiet instead of 6 o'clock and present in whatever way I had previously been. Present. Philip experienced that absence as withdrawal. I experienced it as maintenance. We had different thresholds for what constituted maintenance versus withdrawal, and we had never successfully mapped that difference onto a shared language. The marriage ended because we had stopped knowing how to be in the same room without each other feeling like a critique. It ended because Sophie needed 2 parents who were not conducting a slow, quiet erosion of each other across every dinner table. It ended because I could not make Philip feel like enough, and Philip could not make me feel believed. Those are equally weighted failures, and I want to be clear that I carry my half. I was not an easy person to be married to. I have never been an easy person in any context that required sustained emotional availability in a form that other people could recognize. I show up, I maintain, I document, I keep the evidence. What I do not do naturally or well is narrate my interior in real time and in the register that other people need in order to feel close to me. That costs things. It cost my marriage. I want to be honest about that because the easier version of this story would let me be only the person who was right and the victim of being disbelieved. The true version is that I was also the person who was genuinely difficult to live with, and the difficulty was not entirely about the report, and Philip was not entirely wrong in everything he concluded about me. He was wrong about the specific question of whether the arson determination was sound. He was not wrong about everything. 8 months after the report was overturned, Marcus Keene burned down a second building. The second building was a mixed-use commercial property 3 miles from the Kellner Street warehouse. Keene had acquired it 6 months after the first fire. He had been carrying an insurance policy on it for 4 months when it burned. The fire started at approximately 2 in the morning on a Thursday in November of 2016. It was a Wednesday night that became a Thursday morning, the way disasters do. Arriving in the quiet hours when the structure of the ordinary day has already ended and the new day has not yet started, and there is a window when things can happen that will be much harder to undo. By the time the first engine arrived, the building was fully involved. The fire burned for 6 hours before it was controlled. Rosa Gutierrez was inside. She was 41 years old. She had been the bookkeeper for a freight logistics company that leased second-floor office space in that building. She had stayed late that evening, finishing a quarterly reconciliation that was due the following morning. She had fallen asleep at her desk sometime between 11 and midnight, according to the subsequent investigation. She had earbuds in. She had been listening to something through her phone. The phone that was found melted to the surface of the desk beside her. She did not hear the alarm before the fire reached the stairwell. She did not reach the exit. I heard about the fire from a colleague the next morning, a Thursday morning when I was on my way into the office to file documentation on a different case. My colleague mentioned it in the parking lot, casually, the way you mention a fire to a fire investigator, as professional context. A warehouse district, a fully involved commercial structure. Overnight, he did not yet know anyone had been inside. I heard the address and I felt the specific movement of something cold and accurate traveling down the center of my body. I knew whose property it was before I looked it up. What I felt in that moment is something I have tried to name accurately and have never fully succeeded. It was not guilt in the pure sense, because I had done what I was supposed to do. I had documented correctly. I had filed accurately. I had been overruled by someone with more institutional authority than I had and less evidence than I had, and that overruling was not my failure. But there is a kind of knowledge that sits adjacent to guilt, something in the same territory, something that arrives when you were right about a danger and the danger materialized anyway, and a person who should still be alive is not. That knowledge is not the same as responsibility, but it is not nothing either. It is the weight of having been accurate in a way that did not prevent the thing from happening. I learned Rosa Gutierrez's name that afternoon. I drove past the fire scene on my way home from the office, not for professional reasons, just because I needed to see it. The building was still smoking. There was a section of the south wall still standing, which is sometimes how it goes. The remaining wall stubborn and structural even after everything else is gone. I sat in my truck for 7 minutes in the street outside the scene perimeter. Then I drove home. That evening, I went to the cabinet where I kept my work files, and I took out the gray plastic bin. I took out the manila folder. I sat at my kitchen table with my back angled against the chair in the way that manages the spine pain. And I read the complete report slowly, every page, every photograph, the laboratory analysis, the field notes. I read all of it, and I thought about Rosa Gutierrez, whose name I now knew, who had been 41 years old and had fallen asleep at her desk and had not heard the alarm. I put the folder back in the bin. I put the bin in the storage unit the following weekend. I did not take it out again for a long time. The investigation into the second fire was handled differently than the first, because there was a body and a named victim and a property owner who had now been connected to 2 fires within a year. But the investigation was complicated in ways I was not fully privy to, because by the time it formally accelerated into something that would take years to resolve, I had already left the department. I submitted my resignation in the spring of 2017. I did not make a speech. I gave the paperwork to the Human Resources Administrator on a Monday morning, and I cleared my desk into 2 boxes, which is not a large number of boxes for 17 years of professional work, but I have never accumulated things at a workplace the way some people do. Roderick, the captain, who had been there at the beginning, was retired by then and sent a card. His handwriting was worse than I remembered. I still have the card. Daryl Owens did not acknowledge the resignation in any form. I had not expected him to. I established my independent fire investigation consulting practice the following year. I had the certifications, the case history, and a professional reputation in the insurance industry that had been built through 17 years of accurate, defensible work. Insurance companies that deal in commercial property claims need independent investigators who can read a fire scene and produce a credible origin and cause determination that will hold up under scrutiny. The work requires the same skills as the departmental work without the departmental complications, and it pays better, and nobody overturns my reports. I work mostly for mid-sized commercial insurers, and I am good at what I do. I have a reputation for being thorough, which is the professional version of saying that my reports are difficult to argue with because they do not leave gaps. My clients value this. My clients do not need to know the full history of how I got this way. They benefit from the results regardless. Charlotte in the years after the divorce was a different city for me than it had been before, in the way cities are different when the context changes rather than the geography. Same streets, same weather, same coffee on Garrison Street, different wait to the mornings. I had Sophie on alternating weeks, and I structured my consulting work around those weeks with a level of logistical precision that occasionally surprised the insurance company contacts who expected more professional chaos from an ANS independent contractor. I arrived at Sophie's school events on time, which is to say I arrived 14 minutes early. I maintained the truck. I kept the maintenance log in the glove compartment. My neighbor Renee moved in next door in 2018, the year after the divorce was finalized. She is 53 years old now, and she teaches 8th grade science at a middle school 15 minutes from the neighborhood. She has a laugh that carries across a yard with a force that is entirely disproportionate to her actual volume. A laugh that startled me the first several times I heard it through the fence, and that I have now become so accustomed to that I notice its absence on evenings when she is not home. She is one of those people who possesses warmth as a genuine structural quality rather than a performed one, which means it costs her nothing and it costs you nothing either. She brought a casserole when she moved in, which I did not ask for and did not particularly need, and which I ate alone in my kitchen on a Tuesday evening while reviewing a case file, and which was the best chicken and rice I have had in my adult life. I told her, so the next time I saw her, she said, "I know." She said it as a fact, not a brag. I immediately understood that she was going to be someone I liked. Renee knows about the report. She knows the summary of it, because I am not a person who omits relevant context when explaining why a thing matters. I told her about it one evening, maybe 6 months after she moved in, when we were sitting on her porch in the late summer heat with glasses of iced tea that had both gone watery from neglect, and she listened to all of it without interrupting, which is rarer than people understand. When I finished, she said, "Of course you kept it, Janet. What else were you going to do with it?" And then she laughed. And I thought, yes, that is exactly right. What was I going to do? Throw it away because someone with more years and less evidence told me I was wrong. I was going to keep it. Because I am that kind of person. And she understood that without needing it to be explained as a virtue. She understood it as a simple fact about who I am, the way some people keep receipts and some people do not, and the question of which kind of person is better suited for which kind of world is always, always answered eventually by the world itself. Sophie grew up understanding that her mother had a job involving going to buildings after fires and figuring out what had happened. She understood this the way children understand complex professional work, partially, accurately, and in ways that occasionally surfaced in school in forms I had not anticipated. In 4th grade, her teacher asked the class what their parents did for work. Sophie said, "My mom is a fire detective." The note the teacher sent home afterwards suggested this required some clarification. I clarified. The teacher seemed vaguely disappointed by how ordinary it sounded when properly explained. Sophie is 15 now. She attends Caldwell High School in Charlotte, and she is studying for a chemistry exam with a concentration that I recognize from looking in mirrors for my entire adult life. She has Philip's instinct for timing, meaning she says things at the precise moment they will have the maximum possible effect, and then waits with a patience that is either genetic or learned from watching him do it for 15 years. She has my stubbornness, which she has not yet decided whether to consider a gift or a liability, and which, depending on the week, is both. She has our eyes, the particular shade of brown that is not dark enough to be dramatic and not light enough to be interesting, the eyes that look entirely ordinary in photographs and then in a specific angle of afternoon light look like they carry information. The parent-teacher conference was on a Thursday evening in October of last year. Caldwell High holds them in the main gymnasium with folding tables and chairs arranged by department, so you move from table to table across the polished wood floor and everything smells like industrial cleaner and old sneakers. I arrived at 6:43 for a 7 o'clock start. I had my coffee thermos and a folder with Sophie's most recent chemistry assessment results, which I had requested in advance from the teacher's administrative assistant because I find it useful to have the specific numbers in front of me when discussing the specific numbers. This is not something most parents do. I am aware of this. Philip was there when I arrived. This was expected. We have managed the logistics of Sophie's education, medical appointments, and extracurricular schedule for 9 years with a degree of practical competence that occasionally impresses me and more frequently exhausts both of us. He had his new wife, Brenda, with him, which was also expected. Brenda is a property manager for a residential real estate company, and she has a quality I can only describe as relentlessly pleasant in a way I have always suspected, requires considerable daily effort, and comes at some invisible cost. She smiled when she saw me. I smiled back. We have arrived at the equilibrium of two people who will never be friends and have decided to be genuinely civil instead, which is a kind of achievement that does not get enough credit. The couple standing next to Philip were parents of a girl in Sophie's AP English class. The man worked in commercial real estate. His wife taught yoga at a studio nearby. They were the kind of people who stand in gymnasiums at school events with the posture of people who are comfortable in rooms like this, which is a quality I have never developed. Philip introduced me. He put one hand briefly on my shoulder, which is something he does in public settings that I have never found a clean way to respond to, and he said, This is Janet, Sophie's mom. She used to be a firefighter. Before, well, he laughed. It was a quiet laugh, not unkind, the sound you make when you are filling a gap you are not certain how to fill in any other way, the kind of laugh that is a door closing. I said, "Fire investigator." I said it the way I always say it when someone misidentifies the job. Not loudly, not with emphasis, just accurately. The man in real estate nodded. He said, "That must be interesting work." I said, "It was." Philip moved on to the next table. I found my chair at the chemistry teacher's table and opened my folder and sat with the assessment results I had prepared for no reason, because this was Thursday and I was at the wrong table and the chemistry teacher was on the other side of the gymnasium and I would not reach her for another 25 minutes. I'm telling you about the parent-teacher conference because of what happened 2 weeks later and because context matters. 2 weeks later, on a Tuesday evening, there was a knock at my door. I was in the kitchen when I heard it. Sophie was on her alternating week with Philip, and the house had the particular quality of a house with one person in it when that person is accustomed to the presence of another, a quality that is not exactly quiet, but is a specific temperature. I opened the door. 2 people I did not recognize were standing on my porch. The woman was small and compact, in her early 40s, wearing a blazer that was practical rather than decorative, and carrying nothing in her hands, which is a specific quality of composure. She introduced herself as Special Agent Mira Velasquez, FBI Financial Crimes. The man beside her was taller, early 50s, in a gray suit with the fit of a suit someone else had selected. He said his name was Damon Price and that he was an assistant United States attorney with the Federal Prosecutor's Office for the Western District of North Carolina. He said they were investigating a homicide in connection with a commercial insurance fraud case. He said the victim's name was Rosa Gutierrez. I had not heard that name spoken aloud by another person in 7 years. Something in my spine that has nothing to do with the 2015 injury moved and then, after a moment, released. I said, "Come in." I made coffee because it was a Tuesday evening and I was already on my 3rd cup, and making coffee for new people in my kitchen is a reflex I have never managed to interrupt. We sat at the table. Damon Price put a manila folder on the surface in front of him and left it closed for the moment. He explained the investigation in the methodical way of someone who has explained it many times and has learned which facts go in which order. He said the FBI had been investigating a network of fraudulent commercial insurance claims connected to Marcus Keene and several associated business partners for approximately 3 years. He said the investigation had reached a point where federal charges were being prepared. He said Rosa Gutierrez had been identified, prior to her death, as a potential cooperative witness in the fraud investigation. He said the circumstances of the fire that killed her, combined with the timing of her identification as a potential witness, had expanded the investigation from financial crimes to include federal arson charges and, in the prosecution's assessment, felony murder. He said they had reviewed every existing document connected to both of Marcus Keene's properties and both fire events. He said the only report that had correctly identified the use of an accelerant in a deliberate ignition pattern consistent with the methods used in the second fire was a report filed by a fire investigator from the Charlotte Fire Department in 2016. He said that report had been administratively overturned. He said they needed to locate the investigator who had written it. I looked at him. I said, "That was me." He said he knew. He said his team had been looking for me for 6 weeks because my personnel file with the department contained an address that was 7 years out of date. He said they had eventually located me through the professional directories maintained by several commercial insurance companies that I consult for. He said they were sorry for the difficulty in reaching me. I got up from the table. I went to the second bedroom that serves as my office. The gray plastic bin was on the bottom shelf of the bookcase next to the desk, as it had been for 5 of the past 8 years. I took out the manila folder. I brought it back to the kitchen and placed it on the table in front of Damon Price. He opened it. He read it carefully, not quickly. Mira Velasquez looked at the photographs while he read the text, turning each one in the light the way you do when you are trying to understand 3-dimensional information from a 2-dimensional surface. Neither of them spoke for a considerable time. Damon Price said, "This is complete." I said, "It is a copy. The original is in the department archive under the case number on the cover page." He said, "Every element is here." I said, "Yes." He said they needed to show me one other thing. He opened the manila folder he had brought and turned it to a specific page and placed it on the table in front of me. The document was a signed statement, several pages. He had marked one paragraph with a small yellow flag and indicated I should read from there. The paragraph was written in Marcus Keene's own words, in the first-person voice of someone who has been told by his attorneys that cooperation has specific and limited value and that limited value is expiring. He described the method he had used to set the Kellner Street warehouse fire. He described selecting a petroleum-based accelerant for its properties. He described the application method and the line pattern between the two ignition points. He described the secondary ignition and its position relative to the primary. He described opening the ventilation panel near the roofline. He described confirming the south side doors were unlocked before he left the property. He described every element of the fire that I had documented in the report that had been called inconclusive in March of 2016. He described them in the same sequence I had described them. The only differences were the absence of professional terminology and the absence of photographs. I sat with that for a moment that was longer than most moments. I said, "When did he write this?" Damon Price said, "Approximately 2 months ago." I said, "Has he seen my report?" He said, "That is one of the specific questions we needed to answer before this meeting could proceed." He said his team had conducted a formal investigation of whether the statement had been informed by any external document, including but not limited to my original report or any copy of it. He said they had been able to confirm, through the documentary history of the statement's preparation and through interviews with Keene's counsel, that the statement was written before anyone in the prosecution team had located or reviewed my report. He said the statement was independently produced. The match between the statement and the report exists because both describe the same physical events. He said, "Your report was accurate. It was accurate in March of 2016. It correctly identified every element of the arson that the perpetrator himself has now confirmed in a signed statement to federal prosecutors. The report is the foundational evidentiary document for the arson charges in this case." I said, "Okay." I said that single word, and I sat very still. I have been asked since then to describe what that moment felt like, and I have tried to answer honestly each time. It did not feel like vindication in the way that word is usually meant. Vindication has a brightness to it, a quality of being seen in front of witnesses. What I felt was something quieter and more structural. Something like the specific sensation when a bone that has been slightly out of alignment finally settles into the correct position. Not the surface level relief of a stretch, but the deeper correction of something that has been wrong for a long time finally going right. And underneath that, in the layer below the correction, something that had no name but that had been sitting in the lower left side of my chest for 8 years, adjacent to the grief about Rosa Gutierrez and the anger about Daryl Owens and the exhaustion of carrying the certainty of a thing no one would accept as certain, went quietly and almost entirely still. I called Philip the following morning. I said there were federal investigators who needed to speak with him, not because he had done anything wrong, but because some of the context of what they were documenting involved our former marriage and the time period before it ended. I said it was about the warehouse fire from 2016. There was a pause. He said, "The arson case." I said, "Yes." He said he remembered it. I said the investigators had asked if he would be willing to come to my kitchen table because that was the setting where the relevant documentation existed and where the interview needed to occur. He said he would be there. He did not ask me what to expect. I appreciated that. I did not know what to tell him in any case that would have been fair. He came on a Thursday afternoon 4 days later. He came alone. He sat in the kitchen and looked at the room the way people look at spaces they used to know but do not live in anymore, with the slightly careful attention of someone finding the differences. He did not look at the photographs of Sophie on the refrigerator, which I noticed. He looked at the table. Damon Price was there. Mira Velasquez was there. The manila folder I had brought from the gray plastic bin was on the table. The statement from Marcus Keene was in a separate folder. The meeting lasted 43 minutes. Damon Price explained the investigation, the charges, the nature of the federal arson case. He explained the role of my 2016 report and its position as foundational evidence for the arson documentation. He explained the confession statement and its independent corroboration of every element the report had identified. And then, as he had said to me 9 days earlier at the same table, he said that his team had spent 3 days ruling out the possibility that the suspect's statement had been informed by external documentation before confirming that it was independently produced. He said, the report filed by this investigator in March of 2016 was accurate. It correctly identified every element of the arson method that the perpetrator has now confirmed in his own signed statement. The report is the primary evidentiary document for the arson charges in this case. He said it evenly and without emphasis. He was not making a point to Philip. He was describing the evidentiary history of a federal case. But Philip heard it. I was watching Philip the way I have always watched rooms I am in. Not intensely, not with the kind of watching that makes people self-conscious, but with the peripheral attention that 17 years of reading fire scenes trains into you. And I saw the change move through him. Not dramatically, not with a flinch or a visible breath, something smaller and more internal. The set of his jaw shifting slightly. His hands, which had been resting on the table with the looseness of someone performing relaxation, going still in a way that was actually still rather than performed. The look of a person who has been holding a particular position for a very long time and has just had the structural reason for holding it removed. He did not look at me during the meeting. When Price and Velasquez left, Philip stayed. I poured 2 cups of coffee and put one in front of him and sat down. He looked at the cup for a moment. He said, I thought you were wrong about the fire. I said, I know. He said, I told myself you were fixating. I told myself it was a pattern with you. I used it as evidence of something about you that I needed to believe at the time. I said, I know that too. He said, I told Sophie. After the divorce, I said one of the difficulties in the marriage was that you had a hard time letting things go when you should have moved on. I used the fire as an example. I said, some of that was true in general. He said, not this specific thing. I said, no, not this one. He was quiet for a while. He drank some of the coffee. He put the cup down precisely, the way someone does who is being careful with something because they do not trust themselves not to break it. He said, I'm sorry. I sat with it. I did not say you should be. I did not say 8 years. I did not say a woman is dead because the report you thought was my obsession was actually a documented fact that no one with institutional power was willing to act on. I did not say any of the things that were technically accurate and would have been entirely fair to say in that room on that afternoon. I said, I know. He said, that's not enough, is it? I thought about it. I said, it's something, and it was. It was not the restoration of a marriage, or the recovery of the years, or the reversal of what Sophie had been told. It was not Rosa Gutierrez, alive, and her earbuds out, and the alarm reaching her in time. It was not Daryl Owens in a room being asked to account for the Friday morning decision that came from wherever it came from. It was not any of those things, and it could not be. But it was a man who had believed the wrong story for 8 years, sitting in the right room with the right documents and saying he was sorry and meaning it. That is something. I have made my peace with calling it something. After the federal case moved forward and the charges against Marcus Keene were filed publicly, there was a period of news coverage. Local first, then picked up by a true crime publication that produces long-form audio pieces about fire investigation cases. I was referenced in several of the pieces as the investigator whose overturned report had provided the foundational documentation for the federal arson prosecution. The articles used the phrases proved right and vindicated, which I found accurate but partial in the way that most two-word descriptions of complex 8-year situations tend to be. Renee printed out one of the articles and left it in my mailbox with a sticky note that said, finally, someone else said it. I put the sticky note on the refrigerator. It is still there, beside Sophie's last chemistry assessment, which came back at 91%, which is solid but is not as solid as it will be once she learns to check her unit conversions before submitting the exam rather than after. Sophie read the articles. She came to me on a Saturday morning, which is a morning I protect by not scheduling anything and making pancakes and drinking coffee at a pace that constitutes, for me, something resembling rest. She sat down across from me and put her phone face down on the table and looked at me with the specific quality of attention that tells me she has been thinking about a thing for longer than this moment. She said, so you were right about the fire. this whole time. I said, about the fire? Yes. She said, and Dad said you were obsessed with it. I said, your dad believed what he understood based on what he could see from where he was standing. He was wrong about this specific thing. He was not wrong about every conclusion he drew about me. She thought about that. She said, you kept the report for 8 years. I said, yes. She said, why didn't you tell me? I said, tell you what. She said, that you were right. I looked at my daughter. She is 15 years old, and she is still in the part of life where being right and being believed feel like the same thing. And eventually she will understand that they are not. And I hope by the time that understanding arrives, she will have the tools to carry both conditions separately without one collapsing the other. I said, being right doesn't need an audience. And being believed shouldn't require you to keep announcing the thing you know. Sometimes you just keep the evidence in the box. And you wait until the evidence is needed. She sat with that. She picked up her phone and put it down again. She said, is the box still there? I said, no. I gave the file to the prosecutor. The whole thing, she said, was that hard. I thought about it honestly. I said, easier than I expected, and that is true. I had assumed that giving up the file would feel like a transfer of something structural, like handing over a bone that had become weight-bearing over 8 years of being carried. And there was something like that, but it was quieter than I had anticipated. I put the folder on Damon Price's table on a Wednesday morning, and I drove back to Garrison Street, and I ordered the same coffee I always order, and I sat in the corner chair beside the window, and I watched the street outside, and I thought, all right, that is all I thought. All right, Marcus Keene is awaiting sentencing on federal arson charges, insurance fraud charges, and a felony murder charge in connection with the death of Rosa Gutierrez. I have not attended any of the proceedings. I am not a proceedings person. I provided my documentation, and I will provide a statement if one is required, and that is where my formal involvement ends. I was contacted 3 months ago by a woman named Clara Gutierrez, who is 23 years old and works as a software developer in Austin, Texas. She is Rosa Gutierrez's daughter. She wrote me a letter, an actual physical letter, sealed in an envelope with a return address in the corner. I cannot remember the last time I received a physical letter from someone I did not already know. I read it twice at the kitchen table before I responded. Clara said she had read the news coverage. She said she had read my report, which the prosecutor's office had provided to the family as part of the case documentation. She said she wanted to know whether there had been someone who saw what was going to happen to her mother before it happened and tried to stop it. She said she needed to know if there was a record. I wrote back the same day. I said yes. I said I had seen it and I had documented it and I had filed it and it had not been accepted and I had kept a copy and I was sorry that the machinery that should have worked had not worked in time. I said I was sorry in the specific way of someone who did not cause the failure, but who has thought about the failure enough times over 8 years to know that being adjacent to an uncorrected wrong thing creates its own kind of responsibility, even when you did everything you were supposed to do. I said her mother deserved to be alive. I said the record existed. I said it had always existed. She wrote back and said, thank you for keeping it. That is the sentence I think about most. Not the validation from the prosecutor, not Philip's apology, not the news coverage. Thank you for keeping it, because that is the actual center of what happened over 8 years. Not the investigation, not the overturning, not the second fire or the charges or the confession. The center of it is that I kept the thing that was true when keeping it cost something and offered nothing obvious in return. I have Clara's letter in the filing cabinet in my office. It is in a folder labeled Correspondence Personal. It is next to the maintenance log for the truck I keep meaning to replace and the original field notebook from my first year as an investigator. I keep things. I am that kind of person. The gray plastic bin is still in the office. I filled it with photography books and a miscellaneous collection of hardware store receipts that I have not yet decided how to file. It is just a bin now. It does not have the weight it had for 8 years. When I look at it, I see a bin. My back hurts when the weather changes. I have learned to read the approach of low-pressure systems by the particular quality of the ache in the lower left quadrant of my spine which makes me marginally better at weather forecasting than the average person and considerably worse at ignoring uncomfortable conversations. My physical therapist is named Marco, and he plays jazz in his practice and has, in 4 years of appointments, never once asked about the origin of the injury in a way that required me to explain it fully. I am grateful for that particular form of professional restraint. The coffee on Garrison Street is still the best in the neighborhood. Renee is still next door. Sophie is still working on those unit conversions. The truck has 217,000 miles on it now. The check engine light has been on for so long it is simply part of the landscape of the dashboard, like the cup holder and the maintenance log in the glove compartment. I will replace the truck next year, possibly the year after. Philip sent me a message last month. He said Sophie had told him about the conversation we had on the Saturday morning when she read the articles. He said, "She understands more than either of us thinks she does." I said, "I know." He said, "I think she's going to be like you." I thought about that for a moment. I said, "I hope she keeps the evidence and still makes room for the people." He said, "Yeah." He said, "That would be the best of both of us." I did not respond to that message immediately. I put my phone face down on the counter and I made dinner, and I thought about it for a while. Later that evening, I wrote back and I said, "Yes, that would be." There is a particular kind of integrity that no one watches you practice. You are not doing it for an audience, and you are not doing it with any guaranteed return. You are doing it because you are the kind of person who keeps the thing that is true even when the keeping costs you something. Even when the people whose belief would matter most to you choose to read the keeping as a problem rather than a practice. Even when 8 years go by with the gray plastic bin in the storage unit and then in the second bedroom and nothing happens and nothing is asked and the world shows no particular interest in whether you kept the folder or threw it away. And then one Tuesday evening, there is a knock at the door. She did not leave because she was wrong. She left because being right was costing her everything, and no one was willing to share that cost. 8 years later, the evidence finally caught up. The question is not whether the evidence will catch up. The question is whether you are still holding it when it does.